next Access event this year. Yeah, kindly sponsored by Spirit, and we have some guest speakers here, so we'll introduce in a moment. I'll just cover a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So we are planning to record the call. We might not share the call in full, but it would at least allow us to take some snippets out of the call to share later on. So I'm just letting you know, I'm going to assume you'll get a note at the top of the screen, but I'm going to assume that if you're joining the call, that's okay with you. During the call, we'd love to see your faces, so put your videos on if you're happy to. We're using Teams two-way to give us some feedback and some interaction, so thank you if you're happy sharing your face. We'll ask you to go on to mute during the call. There'll be a breakout session, there'll be a Q&A later on, but we'll ask you to go on to mute just to keep the call quality up for our speakers. I've no doubt that someone will ask us later if we're going to share slides. We are going to share slides after the call. And also I've put the QR code into the chat pane. I'll continue to do that just in case anyone who joins late can't see the historic chat. I can't remember if that works or not. But we'll ask you to use Slido for Q&A because it just helps us to manage the Q&A a little better. So if you have any issues, by all means, put it into the chat pane if you want to chat conversationally. But for Q&A that you want to go to the speakers, I'll ask you to put it into Slido. We know that we won't have time to get through the volume of questions that we hope you're going to ask us. So Liz has kindly agreed that we'll have a look at the Q&A afterwards, and if there's any that we think we can follow up on, that we'll commit to doing a bit of that. So I'll just start with a little word from Access before we get up and going. So it's great to have you here. Hopefully you already know a little bit about Access. I didn't introduce myself yet. I'm Karen Blanc, I'm the chair. So Access is run by a group of volunteers in and around our day jobs, which you can imagine has been a lot during the last couple of years during lockdown. And we really had to change how we work as well. We organising meetings in person was quite a big part of what we did when such things were possible, and they will be possible again in our future. Lots of the work that we do, so our focus is on gender equality across the energy sector, but lots of the work we do is about shifting the issue from being a problem that women are fixing to a problem that organisations should be solving, and that's what the conversation today is about as well, is about helping people in leadership positions, I mean, as well as ourselves and how we're impacted, but helping people in leadership positions to retain talented women by understanding a life change that many of us will go through. Right, I'm going to move on. I'm going to hand to you in a moment, Dan, but first of all, I'm going to open a poll on Slido. So if you've found your way to Slido, either on your phone or in a side browser, you should see a poll available to you now, and I'll just share that on screen. So if you could take part, we'd love you to, and we'll show you the results as you vote. So I'm just going to share this for anyone who's not looking at a screen. Oh, that's interesting. Can everyone see the results on the screen? So I'm doing too many things. I'm not able to vote as well. So, but thank you all for taking part. And it's a shifting picture. Okay, I'll just keep that up for a little second, and I'll just close it in a minute or two, and then there'll be another poll later on. We'll come back to Slido, but you should have two little tabs at the top of your device. So you've got one for polls and one for Q&A. So as you think of questions, put them in there. You can vote for other people's questions, so you don't have to ask the same thing twice, and we'll use the voting to help us choose a few top questions to ask when we come to that later on in the call. Right, Daniel, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. Thank you. Spirit are pleased to host this event, and it's great to see. I can see almost 100 people on this event, which is great. Before we start, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. The first I'd like to introduce is Liz. Liz has a diverse career spanning over 3 decades in a corporate function, mostly aligned in science and technology disciplines. Liz is going to share with us today her personal experience of holding down a corporate role whilst experiencing a decade of whilst experiencing a decade-long journey through the menopause, which impacted both her work and her home life, and she'll share that story with us today. Susan is a woman of a certain age and is very proud of it, she tells me. She's been around the oil and gas industry since 1988 and now runs her own coaching business. Susan's going to offer a different perspective. Susan's probably one of the few ladies who suffered few, if any, symptoms of the menopause. And then finally, I'll introduce myself. My name's Dan. I've been in the oil and gas industry for 20 years. And I'll be honest, I am clueless about the menopause. It's been quite interesting in preparing for this event. I've been contacted by a number of people, and at the risk of probably simplifying the supportive comments and the feedback I've received, I can probably break down the comments into 2 categories. From women, I've typically had, "It's great to see you being involved, and don't worry, we don't know what we don't know what the menopause is as well." From the men, I'm typically getting comments of, "Aren't you nervous you'll say something wrong? And what do you know about the menopause, and what can you add?" So I'm going to address the men's questions before I pass over to Liz. So I can confirm I am a little nervous, probably talking about the menopause, and I am nervous I'll probably say something wrong. But I think men can add something to this topic. In this day and age, it's very easy for Google to answer a lot of our questions. But to me, by searching for Google, it doesn't make things less taboo. If anything, it can make them more taboo. I do believe the way we can make these subjects or these topics less taboo is that we can talk about them, and talk about them in safe arenas and events like this. And I think for men, it's important we participate in that, because that will make the subject less taboo. So with that, and hopefully to help me be a little less clueless on the subject, I'm going to pass over to Liz, who is hopefully can answer my first question today, which is, what is the menopause, Liz?
Daniel, thank you so much for that great introduction. And I love the fact that you pointed out that you were feeling a little nervous about saying the wrong thing. I think with most areas of inclusion, it's less about whether you'll say the wrong thing, but the intent with which you say it. So as long as you're coming from a good place of positive intent and curiosity, then, well, personally, from my point of view, I don't mind what you say or how you say it. It's more that you want to broach the conversation, and I'm delighted to have you lead this particular thing on behalf of the men in the room. But also for all the women here who are realizing that there are some men out there who are interested in this stuff as well, because it affects you as well. So let's have a think about what this menopause thing is. So when I started to suffer from perimenopause symptoms in my mid-40s, it took me about 4 years, and indeed my GP 4 years, before either of us realized that that's what I was going through. My advantage was I come from a scientific background. So the moment I found out what it was, I went and did the research, which is actually quite scary, but nonetheless, let's have a little look and see what this thing is. So I'm just going to share a slide, because I think sometimes looking at something is useful. Hopefully you can now see a slide. So this is basically what menopause is. The image represents a basic pattern through the female life cycle of estrogen and progesterone, which are those 2 critical hormones for procreation. They are the 2 hormones that provide the building blocks for pregnancy and birth. And you'll see right at the start, we've got a little of both. It ramps up during puberty, and anyone on the call who has had teenage daughters, or indeed been one, you'll know how that felt. And then we have this broad period of time, 20, 30 years, where our estrogen is quite level and our progesterone does the monthly ups and downs we might know well through our menstrual cycles. In natural menopause, it's at the end of this time where nature's decided there isn't any need for childbearing, so these hormones aren't needed at such high levels. Bluntly, it means that eventually we stop menstruating. I know that's an uncomfortable term for some, but there we are, that's what it is. And there are 3 key phases of the menopause transition, and 2 of them are shown here. The first phase is what we call perimenopause. That's when the reproductive hormones start to decrease. The average age to start this is around 45, 46 years of age, and it can take anything between 4 and 10 plus years. So this isn't necessarily a speedy transition. However, for a small number of women, there is something called spontaneous menopause where it will almost happen overnight. What you'll see through perimenopause is, if you look at that nice up and down flow of progesterone and that nice even level of estrogen, it all goes a little bit bonkers. And it's the severity of that wildness that leads to some of the effects that we start to feel. And as estrogen alone has over 300 functions in the body, it's not surprising that as it reduces, our body can respond with many different reactions. The second phase is the bit that I've called menopause, and this is the cessation of the menstrual cycle. So this is officially 1 year after the date of your very last cycle. But it's also used as a catch-all term that takes you on the whole journey, excuse me, from perimenopause through to that date and then on into postmenopause. And the global average age for this is 50 years of age. But for 1 in 100 women, this will happen in their 40s or even earlier. It's not unknown for this to happen in your early 30s. And that brings with it not only the host of symptoms that you might be suffering, but the news of low or no fertility at a time when you might be wanting to start a family. In addition, some women will enter menopause for other medical reasons. Surgical interventions such as hysterectomy, chemical interventions such as some forms of chemotherapy can bring on instant menopause. And these women will be experiencing menopause alongside the trauma of their treatment. The third phase is the bit after menopause, what we call postmenopause. And at this point, the balance of hormones is stable, but the body is now coping with a different cocktail of hormones than it was before. And with the extended life expectancy of many nations, this phase can be a third of a woman's life. Used to be an end of life experience, the menopause, and now it's very much a midlife experience. So that's a little bit about the science, but what about these symptoms? Here's a list. 44 common symptoms and counting, I think, is the general understanding at the moment. And this is because if you think about it, estrogen alone, 300 functions in the body, changes in that hormone balance within your body is going to produce some interesting side effects. And current research is showing that whilst some of the Western symptoms that are most known about are the physical symptoms like hot flushes and night sweats, actually around 87% of women, for them, it's the memory lapses, poor concentration, anxiety, even depression that causes them the most concern. They can almost cope with the physical stuff. It's the impact on mental health that can have a knock-on impact. And part of that is where our estrogen is made in our bodies. It's made in 2 places, mostly in the reproductive organs, also in the adrenal gland. And it's only a small amount that's made there, but we do need a bit. The moment our cortisol and adrenaline rise, it takes over the tiny bit of estrogen that we have in there. So the more stressful our lives, the more anxious our lives, the more likely we are to be suffering from some of these symptoms, particularly the mental health ones. So some of these symptoms, you're not going to get them all. I mean, that's the relief, right? You'll probably get a handful of them, but you'll get a different mix from someone else. They might begin suddenly and be really noticeable, or they might be really mild at first. Sometimes they happen most of the time once they begin, or they might just come up once in a while. Women will experience a handful of symptoms, some will experience many, and some will barely notice it. Susan, I think you count yourself in one of the sort of 6% of women who barely notice it.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sure other people have had maybe grumpier or whatever, but yeah, no, I'm at the stage now that I'm kind of looking back to see, was there a stage that I would say that I went through this? Maybe there was a bit of time to do with memory kind of side of things, but when I went to the doctor to speak about it, it was really about, it's a busy life. Yeah. So, you know, it did something happen then? I don't know, never got tested for it, but yes, I would say that I'm one of the lucky ones who wants to kind of understand, you know, what's going on here, and how can we help people.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Susan. And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? That connection with the busyness of life. Sometimes we can blame the busyness on the symptoms. Sometimes we might feel that the symptoms are causing some of the challenges we're having coping with the busyness. The key thing is to be curious about how your body is and what it's experiencing. You know, for myself, I've managed to clock up at least 20 of these over the past 10 years. And despite officially being post-menopause now, I'm still finding new ones cropping up. There's also some really interesting research differences across some cultures. So, for instance, women with Black, Asian, or Latin American ancestry are likely to begin menopause earlier than the global average. In Japan and the Philippines, it's likely to be a bit later, and they don't report overheating, but have problems with more with headaches and joint stiffness. But interestingly, what we find is differences among women with the same cultural background can be even greater than that across cultures. So it's too simplistic to start talking in chunks of culture. But what we do know is that socioeconomic, environmental, and dietary factors can influence symptoms too. But 94% of women are going to find it debilitating at some point, which is why it's important to understand. Does that help, Dan, with your question?
It does a little bit. I guess one question I've got is, so the menopause starts, and I'm an engineer. It's got a start and an end. It doesn't sound like it's got an end, but it's saying, or it maybe got an end, but it's not very clear. Those symptoms you've put out there, are they, if you look at a distribution, do they, if you know, in the first 2 years, do you experience all of those symptoms and then it's, you know, it kind of wanes, or do you get, you know, how are they distributed typically, or is it?
Yeah, so interestingly, there isn't very much typical about the menopause. It's like any syndrome in that people will experience different things depending on their own physiology. There is some sense that if you are lean and fit in your 40s, you might have slightly less symptoms. I really wish somebody had told me that before I got to 57. But quite often the first thing that people notice that they recognize as menopause is the temperature control. So hot flushes is very common, surges of progesterone that causes your body to overheat. You quite typically would see you know, a woman fanning themselves or asking for some sort of temperature control in the office, and that might be the first time they recognize that they are in menopause, when they could have had symptoms much earlier than that. For me, the first symptom I got was bad skin. So I suffered from, I guess, what I would call teenage skin, which was really irritating because I didn't actually have that when I was a teenager. I started to gain weight even though my diet and exercise routine hadn't changed. I just thought maybe I was subconsciously eating more or something. And then the worst thing was, for me, the brain fog. And I didn't recognize that as menopause because it wasn't being talked about. But progesterone, when it starts to surge in this wild phase, it causes a blockage in the brain energy. So you're not losing your cognitive ability, but you are losing your brain energy. And I started to forget things. I started to put things down in strange places. And the big family joke was, the washing powder being in the fridge, and then not realizing where I'd put it. Moments in meetings where I just forgot what I was saying when I knew the topic really well, and then getting really embarrassed and worried about my business performance. And knowing that that was to do with menopause, I really wish I'd known that earlier, because I started to worry I was getting early onset dementia. And from my experience working with women who are going through the menopause now, I understand that that's not an uncommon feeling. So I think, from that perspective, we all get it differently. But it's the more we understand about the symptoms, and there's some great chat going on at the moment around some references, and we'll put out some references after this conversation as well. The more we understand about what the symptoms can be, we might just start to go, hang on a minute, I've done something strange here, or I'm not feeling myself. Do I know enough about my cycle to know that this is something that might be happening? So women who track their cycle, and there's lots of great apps out there at the moment. Dr. Louise Newson has one called Balance, which is apparently very good. Again, unfortunately launched too late for me, but hopefully in time for some of you. These sorts of things can really help us get a handle on what's going on for us. So if our menstrual cycles have started to become a bit irregular, this might be, or not characteristic, it might be something worth thinking about.
And so a question pops up for me as well while we're on the science of it all. I'm just kind of conscious that as women go through their lives, they're probably the ones that are messing about with the chemical balance of their body a little bit more than the blokes are. Between contraception, in my case, and many other people's case, IVF treatments.
Yeah.
I just wonder, is there any evidence or research to show how that affects menopausal symptoms or the menopause? Might be too technical, I don't know. But.
No. I think it's a really good question, Susan. And actually, there's very little tangible research. And I think part of that is because we all go through this in such different ways, and different forms of contraception have different outcomes. What was interesting for me, and I apologize if for some of you this is too much information, I had the Marina coil fitted when I was around 38, 39 as a contraceptive measure. And that for me stopped my periods, but it didn't mean I was going into menopause. It was just its impact on my body in terms of contraception. It doesn't happen that way for everybody who has a coil fitted, but it did for me. As a result, I had no clue whether my cycle was starting to change because I wasn't having a cycle. So it made the recognition of menopause perhaps a little trickier. What I do think is that women will all benefit if we just get much more educated about what our hormones do right from teenage. So there's some really tangible research around performance now that says that if we could plot our performance against our menstrual cycle, there would be an optimum week when we would go for our powerful job interviews, do our keynote speeches, aim for that promotion. And there's 1 week a month where we really shouldn't go anywhere near any of that stuff. And if we could teach our kids that, wouldn't that be great?
Good stuff. Just moving on a little bit. I mean, I see there's great questions in the chat that we'll pick up later. But I can just move it on a little bit and think about why are we talking about this at all, and why are we talking about it now?
Yeah, do you know,
It
I think
seems to
that's
be
really,
the thing to speak about.
yeah, it really is, isn't it? And I think, I guess all aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion get their day, and maybe this is ours. What's quite interesting, of course, is that it impacts 50-odd% of the global population, and indirectly, it's going to affect the rest of you. So, um, it does affect all of us. I mean, there started to be a little bit more sharing. I think somebody's mentioned Mariella Foster in the chat. She really started it about 4 or 5 years ago with a documentary that was on the BBC. Davina McCall has picked it up, obviously this year, in a very high profile way. Lots of celebrity women of a certain age in the UK have started to talk about it. Michelle Obama mentioned it in her memoirs after leaving the White House, and talked about how it felt to have the menopause when you were the first lady. And I think part of it is just a recognition that for us, it's not an end of life thing. We are a growing demographic, the women who are over 40. In the coming decades, the over 50s age group will become the largest group demographic, even by 1930. And it's estimated that 1.2 billion women worldwide will be postmenopausal or menopausal by that time. So that's just around the corner, really. The other interesting thing is about 80% of the women going through menopause are in the workplace, which is why this then becomes a workplace topic, because more and more women are staying at work after menopause, whereas perhaps in different times, either women would have stayed at home, or companies were encouraging people to take early retirement. And of course, now nobody can afford to take early retirement. They have to stick with the work. Now, we do know that around 10% of women have left the workplace purely because they've been unable to manage their menopause symptoms at work. And if you think of that, I think Bupa's research in 2019 put that figure at 900,000 women. So almost 1 million women saying that they had left work because of the menopause. And that's an enormous waste of talent, of development, and potential at a time when we are trying to create gender diverse workplaces. We're seeking to find balance in the boardroom in terms of gender equity. And it's not just all of that. There's something about if 80% of women are going to suffer from some form of debilitating symptoms, recognizing only 6% get off scot-free, that impacts their work, it impacts home lives, it impacts relationships. There's a recent survey by a company called Fertifa, who also deal with things like IVF research and things. And their research showed that in the US, UK, and Europe, up to 42% of women will seriously consider leaving the workplace because of the way the symptoms make them feel. And this life stage, so the demographic in the UK for the ages 51 to 54, sees the highest rates of divorce and the highest rate of female suicide. So this is a serious topic as well, not just one for diversity and inclusion. So that helped a bit with your question, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and it's and I guess my question's leading into, and I think you probably answered it already, but it's why should I as or society care? And I'm just thinking from maybe you're getting a male perspective in it, obviously in the male domain at the moment, a lot of conversation now about mental health and pieces. And it does seem that there's a similarity here in that dial, with the menopause.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of this is about the more we can talk about it. So my mother's generation definitely didn't. The first conversation I had with my mother about menopause was I was suffering from it myself. I was in a corporate environment. I was sad that people were coming to me for confidential conversations because there was no other way of getting a voice heard in the workplace. And all of those women that I spoke to within the company that I was in, and actually a company that prides itself on its diversity and inclusion and its psychological safety, and women still didn't want to talk about it, was that even though I was meeting other women who were suffering from it through my coaching work, they didn't want anyone else to know, and that included the other women, because there was this sense that they might be judged. I think women in particular, I mean, I think we all do, men too, but our very identities are often tied up with the work that we do. So we don't want to feel that we're losing that part of ourselves. And also many organizations are really highly performance led. So if there's this sense of a fear of being judged and found wanting in terms of your performance, or even admitting that you might be feeling a drop off in that performance, no matter how temporary, there's a worry that you might be blocked from progression, or that people might start to think of you differently. So you just don't want to say it. But I think you're right, Dan, this has an impact, for the men too. And it's talking about mental health, but actually this affects everyone who loves a woman or cares for a woman as well. So if you think of the impact that these symptoms can have on home life relationships as well as workplace relationships, I've gathered stories from men, children, and managers who care about these women. There was a man I spoke to who found himself walking away from a relationship he didn't really want to leave, because he just didn't understand what his partner was going through, couldn't communicate, a bit like you were saying at the beginning, was too afraid to say the wrong thing, Dan, so didn't say anything at all. And it just caused a massive block in their communication. In an extreme level, my parents split up when my mum was 49, and going back and looking at, she's in her 80s now, but going back and looking at that experience, she said he left her because she wasn't the woman he married. But when she tried to speak about menopause to a doctor, the response was, why can't you just pull your socks up? A very British phrase, but that was how it was dealt with in the 70s and 80s. It was just buried. You didn't speak about it. I spoke to another man who married a woman a little older than him, couldn't understand what was going through. She didn't actually understand what she was going through either. And he buried his confusion in work. Longer hours, longer absences from home, because he didn't know how to communicate when he was at home. And it ended up with him having his own mental breakdown. And he was just broken by this inability to help a woman he loved dearly. On the other scale, I've also coached a young graduate who had always seen her mum as her rock. And then she was away from home for the first time, in a job where she was expected to leap into this high performance. And she was just floundering because this rock she had at home was not there anymore, not the person that she knew. And also, we can't underestimate this from a manager's point of view. I spoke to a really lovely, award-winning male people manager, and he shared that he'd got a young woman on his team who'd been through surgical menopause, and she was clearly struggling, but he just didn't know how to open the conversation. And it was causing him anxiety outside the times that they were together, because he just didn't know what to say. He felt really helpless. So I think this really is a topic for everyone. And the more we can understand it, the more we feel able to have these conversations, whether they're with our loved ones or our GPs or our colleagues or our managers, the more we're likely to survive and thrive, and the less likely we are to suffer from some of this negative impact on relationships or performance.
It's interesting you talk about, to me, it's, my wife, I'm not going to give away her age, but she's in that age boundary you're talking about there. And you'd like to think your loved ones is ones where you can have those conversations, but I never I was embarrassed not embarrassed, maybe I was embarrassed to talk about the menopause with my wife. And sometimes you just need that initiator. And I'll be honest, preparing for this event has actually helped us have that conversation. Because I think once the difficult thing is starting the conversation. Once the conversation started, sometimes difficult to stop it, but it's getting that conversation started, which is sometimes difficult. And I've certainly found, just preparing for this has helped me initiate a conversation with my wife, but also in the workplace, which I would find difficult to start.
Yeah, and I've just seen a chat pop up saying that somebody had sat down with their husband to watch the Davina McCall documentary. I think anything that you can do together. I mean, the thing that started me going is I went to a conference in 2019, which was one of the first big conferences that was held by a mental health charity in London, actually, looking at menopause at work. And there were around 100 or so in the audience, which was already telling, because normally their free conferences have 200 or 300 people attending. So people in just in February 2019 were uncomfortable in attending. And there were only 4 men in the audience. One was somebody I'd taken with me from work who was actually brilliant. 2 were from a benefits organization trying to sell their benefits packages. And 1 was an HR director's husband. And she brought him along so that he could listen firsthand. And he was sharing afterwards that actually they hadn't been able to have a conversation, but now he could. I think perhaps a little extreme, but the guy I took with me he was in his 60s, but he had a younger wife who hadn't reached menopause yet, and he was so curious after the conference that he bought a book on it. And when they went away on holiday, he was reading it on the aeroplane, quite openly and loud and proud. I'm reading this book on menopause, and his wife was embarrassed. So, really interesting, the way we can react to this. The more open we can make it, the better. The more we can share it, the more it stops being a taboo, and we stop having to have special events, because this is just a normal conversation.
I saw in the news in October, I think earlier in the month, I think it was Timpson's, the key manufacturers. They were one of the first UK companies, I think, to allow hormone replacement treatment to be put on expenses. Yeah. I've heard this hormone replacement treatment being discussed, but what is that?
So so HRT, or hormone replacement therapy, is a way of synthesizing your estrogen and progesterone, and sometimes testosterone as well. It depends on the mix, according to your own needs. So there's HRT is a sort of catch-all, like you might say pain relief. It's a catch-all for putting some of the estrogen and progesterone back into your body, so the symptoms are less. So a bit like if you have I mean, it's not the same, and I'm not trying to put it in the same bracket, but if you think about diabetes, you have diabetes, it's a hormone deficiency, it's an insulin issue. So you give people artificial insulin to help them. And the same way, if you have low thyroid function, which interestingly is also somehow linked to the menopause, that you give them levothyroxine, and it replaces your own thyroxine in your body. So HRT is replacing either the estrogen or the progesterone, or both, and sometimes there's a testosterone element to it as well, to balance out those hormones. When it started back in the 80s, when it was really more widely available, there was some research that was published that it caused breast cancer. That's now been largely debunked. There will be a small number of women for whom this isn't appropriate, but most women can take some form of HRT, and it's now being encouraged that they even consider taking it for much longer than the menopause symptoms exist, because the lack of estrogen is now being linked to dementia, to osteoporosis, to heart disease, to some of the other hormone fluctuations that come with older age. So that's really interesting in itself. It's not a catch-all for everyone. Not everyone wants to take an artificial hormone. There are homeopathic solutions as well, holistic ways of dealing with it. You can manage a lot through diet and exercise, very specific diets. But that's it. But I personally take HRT. I've done both. So I started on HRT. Interestingly, GPs aren't actually that educated all the time in this area. So after 2 years, my GP practice decided to block my prescription because they thought 2 years was quite enough. Apart from having a minor meltdown that my crutch was being taken away from me, I then spent 3 years spending a fortune in certain holistic remedy shops in the high street, trying to backfill the hormone response, the symptom response. And then eventually went back to my GP, different GP, said, why aren't you on HRT? And I said, well, I don't know, because someone took me off it. So I've since been back on it again for the last 4 years, and I'm planning on taking it until they tell me I can't. So.
I'm just going to interrupt and remind us to head to our breakout rooms. It's a great chat.
Yeah,
so
thank you very much, Susan. That was just where I was going, and I think we've got lots in the chat now, and perhaps some, some good thoughts about what it is and why we should care, and a few of those scary statistics. So, Stephen, I know that you're on hand to do the technical stuff. If you could put everybody into breakout rooms, what I'd love you to do is just for the next 15 minutes, meet the people in your room if you don't know them, and just talk about what you've just heard. Perhaps you have some stories of your own to share, or some realizations about somebody that you know or knew. Perhaps it was your mum when you were a teenager. And think about whether there are any questions that you would like answered, either during this session or, as Karen said in her run-up, we will try and do a question document at the end for any questions that are left over. And we'll be giving you a reference sheet as well. Some of you have been already putting some wonderful references in the chat. We have some others as well, so we'll compile a list of the best and send those out afterwards too. So Stephen, work your magic with the breakout rooms, and we'll see you back here in around 15 minutes.
The room's all created now, so everybody should be getting their invites.
Lovely, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. I think we're going to
Hi, Amanda. Oh,
You know, you like sitting at your desk having hot flushes, and your female neighbour say to you, "Oh, are you feeling hot, Melinda?" The cardigan goes off again, comes on again. You know, so it's not just men. I think it's younger women are just we just don't seem to have been educated about it at all. And I think health concerns as well, like it's like perimenopause, that you don't really appreciate what's going on. And I think, you know, there is links to dementia and Alzheimer's now about, you know, so just lack of education, really.
Yeah, totally. One thing that I think it was yourself, Susan, that said it in the main session was around how busy life can kind of mask it, I guess. And I think that's one thing that I definitely identify with now, working mum with two, life chaos. And as I move into that, it's good to have the awareness that actually seeking help isn't going to be something that's frowned upon when I feel that that time has come, I guess.
Yeah, I'm 46.
And it could be to do with something else, of course. But the fact that the GP is not even willing to explore that this concept would, my GP just basically said, you know, you're very busy, go away. Yeah, which might have been the case, but didn't, you know, when I look back and I think actually there could have been something going on, but I just missed it. Sorry, Debbie, I think I got across to you there.
That's okay. I was just going to say I'm 46 and in it at the moment, and wasn't recognised, and so I had to go. So someone, I was speaking to another lady, and she passed me on to a private clinician that then was able to help, and it honestly turned my life around, because looking at it now, I just didn't understand any of it at all, and it was just becoming, it's quite severe, you know, and not being able to get any help was difficult. So it's the GPs don't have no education at all in it.
I think that's a really important piece.
I find it really hard. Sorry, I'm 46 as well, and I'm kind of in the perimenopause. But I went to a nurse appointment actually for something else, and I mentioned a couple of things, and she goes, "Oh yeah, it sounds like you're in perimenopause. It's fine. Just get on with it." And I'm like, "What? Okay, fine. I'll just go and research this and deal with it myself. Thank you." But I'm kind of quite unlucky in that my mum sailed through the whole lot, and it was just, as far as she was concerned, her menstrual cycle stopped, and that was it. She had no other symptoms. My mum's sister, she went into menopause through a hysterectomy, and she had no symptoms either whatsoever. She just kind of sailed through it. So for me, it's quite
Wow, well, I hope you had some good discussions, everybody. I know that Daniel and I did. We were both in the room together with a lovely lady who was very open with her sharing. So thank you so much to her. So Karen, I don't know if you have got some sight of some questions.
I do, yeah. Thanks, Liz. We've got some great questions in the Q&A. So what I'll maybe do, because we're going to take 10 minutes now to try and work through some of these questions, aren't we? And I know that people are keen for follow-up as well. So if there are things that we think are important and we don't get to them, we've got that commitment. So I'm going to use the voting function because that's helped sort what people really want to hear about, but continue raising questions while we're talking. So I will just come to you with the first question and we can talk about who's going to answer. But the top question at the moment asks, what practical steps can we take as leaders to challenge the fear around discussing the menopause in the workplace?
That's a lovely one. Are you guys happy for me to dive in with a few suggestions and then you come in as well if you've got some?
Yeah.
So I think that's lovely. I think curiosity is, for me, the number one thing. Curiosity and then empathetic listening, if we can start conversations with those two things in mind, I think then that really helps. If you're a leader trying to have a conversation with somebody, I think it's also just being really mindful that some women aren't going to want to speak about this. No matter how safe you think you are, they may just not want to. I mean, we're talking about this in this environment because this is a taboo in Western culture. In some cultures, it's even more of a taboo. You just don't talk about private things, particularly in the workplace. So I would guess as a leader, don't feel that it's a reflection on you if somebody isn't ready to talk. I would also just err on the side of caution. If somebody's having a bit of a mad day, don't just assume they're menopausal, please. They might just be having a bad day, and it's probably going to get you into trouble if you suggest otherwise. I think the more you can normalize this. So we had a conversation in our breakout room around avoiding medicalizing it and making it all about the sickness, leaving the sickness and absence policy, or leaving any policy actually, but just normalizing this life stage. One of the ways you can do that is just by using the word, not being afraid of it in the same way that we're starting to get less afraid of some of the other diversity, equity, and inclusion language. We talk much more openly about mental health in the workplace now. It doesn't mean everybody wants to share their mental health challenges, but it's more acceptable. So the more we can talk about it, the better. So if you were thinking about running a conversation about it in your team, then I would think of positioning it within the diversity and inclusion initiatives, rather than thinking, right, we're going to have a conversation and I'm going to get the oldest woman in the team to run it, which is probably not the right way to go about making that woman feel safe. So the other thing is we'll, in the resource sheet, we'll share a link, but there are loads of companies out there trying to help leaders with this. The easiest place to go is the CIPD. So the CIPD offer free guidance for businesses and for leaders on menopause and guidelines for managing menopause. So the link will be in the resource sheet that we send out, but it's relatively easy to find on the CIPD's website. You don't have to be a member to find it. So that's probably a first port of call.
That's great. Thank you so much, Liz. So possibly somewhat related.
I think Susan might have something to add there.
Oh, go on.
Susan, I think you're on mute, my love. Oh, can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Oh, no.
We'll give you a little moment. I'll pop to the next question, Susan.
I could maybe just add a little bit, and
yeah, please.
And certainly it's a conversation I've not had in the company in the last month. But as I touched on before, it's it's finding that initiator to have the conversation. And I would, as leaders, I think it's important that actually we encourage men to open that conversation a little bit. Unfortunately, we're not in a position where we've got 50% female, 50% male in the workplace. So unfortunately, if you do have that conversation in a team environment, you're probably going to end up with it being 80% men and 20% female. And you know, that's I wouldn't say a comfortable position to be in. So I think it is have the conversation, but let's not have it in a team environment. I think it's just having not one-to-ones, but it's that coffee point kind of discussions, not the negative coffee point conversations. It's that, and it's, I think for me, it's being interested, humble but interested. You don't need to have, for me, it's a realization of the last month. You don't need to have the, you know, as a leader, you kind of think, oh, you've got to have the answer. To me, you don't have to have the answer. You just need to be interested and a little bit humble.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and I think it's just reminding yourselves, Daniel, as men, that this, you know, this is going to affect a woman that you love somewhere. It impacts transgender men as well. It's interestingly, and I think if you can think of that, then you know, actually, the 20-year-old young man in the workplace who might be thinking their mum's gone a bit weird might have just as much interest in this topic than somebody who is married to a lady of a certain age, or indeed is a lady of a certain age. And I think recognizing that some women will hit this in their 30s and 40s as well doesn't make this a midlife conversation either. And the more we can talk about all of these life stages as natural, then you know, it's just becomes much easier. There's a good point just popped up in the chat actually about andropause. So there's the other name for the male menopause. I certainly wouldn't want to detract from anybody suffering from andropause symptoms by thinking that this is all about the women. The difference between andropause and menopause is, first of all, andropause doesn't affect every man. Some men manage to continue to produce testosterone right into their late 80s. And the other thing is it tends to be later onset. So andropause tends to, I mean, obviously there are going to be exceptions, but it tends to start to happen in the 70s rather than the 50s or 40s. And therefore it's less likely to show up in the workplace. So if you think that we're having a workplace conversation about menopause, it's less likely to be a topic. But again, a really good trigger for having a conversation about the differences.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Susan, I think, has just dropped off to see if she can get her sound sorted, so hopefully she'll be back with us shortly.
I'm
you're
back.
back! Hooray!
Technical log off on then.
Yeah,
I am here. I don't know if I'm
just get you
spotlighted or not.
Yeah, we'll get you pinned back onto the screen.
No worries. I was just kind of mentioning in terms of like the piece about, you know, how do you tackle it in this workplace. Sorry, I maybe a little bit back in the conversation.
We're still there. Yeah.
But you know, part of it is that in the discussion group that we had, it was about the normalizing this conversation. And it's the first time we've really spoken about that. It's a normal thing. So us finding language that's okay to have this discussion. And also, it also struck me that if you've got people in your organization who are comfortable with this discussion, then, you know, highlight that these folks are happy to have these kind of conversations, so you know who you can go and speak to. And as Liz mentioned, you know, it can be quite, it can be very personal here. You know, if you're going to be admitting that you've got, you know, brain fog, what's that going to do to the rest of your career? You don't necessarily want to be telling your manager that. So if you can have advocates as well, might be useful.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I'm conscious that we definitely won't fit many questions into this section, but there's one that's come up a couple of times, so maybe put that one to you quickly. It's about menopause policy. So somebody's asked how many companies actually have a policy, and somebody's asked if Spirit have a policy, what does it cover, how does it help? So yes, any thoughts on policies?
I can do. Daniel, do you want to talk about Spirit?
I can do. So Spirit don't hold a policy, but we issued some guidelines, which I would say are useful. We were talking a little bit on the breakout room, and I'm sorry, Liz, you're going to hear it again, but I think it's quite a nice, I quite like the analogy. So so my wife works in the maternity hospital, and one of the things that they have done actually there is stop referring to the females in pregnancy as patients. They are actively referred to as clients, and you might say that's a bit of you know, political correctness gone wrong and all this kind of good stuff. But the rationale behind it was, when you're in pregnancy, you're not ill, you're not sick, you're going through a normal phase. And I think from what I can see is, and I'm not shining a big light on Spirit there, because there's always more stuff we can do, but by potentially, like, I think most companies, I believe, treat it via a sickness and absence policy, and therefore you inherently make it an illness, and it's not an illness. Companies I know do have maternity policies and pieces, but what Spirit have done, which I believe, is we've put in place a guideline at the time. Maybe a policy is best, I don't know. Maybe you've got some views on that, Liz. But certainly, yeah, we've got a guideline, and I think it's important we do differentiate it, me personally, from an absence and sickness, because it's not a sickness that's been experienced.
Yeah, and I agree, Daniel. I think there will be companies for whom a policy feels necessary. My hope, I guess, is that if we have guidelines and information on how to have the conversation and resources where people can go to find out more, that a policy isn't necessary, because a policy potentially isn't normalizing it. It's creating more of a thing, if you like, than this needs to be when it affects 50% of the population. You know, not every woman will choose to have a child or can have a child, but every woman will experience menopause. And, you know, it absolutely isn't an illness. Leaving the sickness and absence policy, I think, is a misnomer. It's not an illness, absolutely, as you said. If your company is one that needs to have policy in order to embed a habit or a practice, then there's nothing wrong with having a policy. And there are plenty of companies out there who are launching policies. Diageo, I'm just trying to think, some of the banks, so HSBC has recently launched one, quite publicly, Vodafone. On the other hand, you've got some organizations that are choosing to phrase their work as guidelines, which I think is a little softer and is perhaps a little bit more, you know, heading towards the normalization.
Just kind of interest of time, and you know, we've still got a little bit we want to cover, I know. So as Karen mentioned, we'll kind of gather some of the questions that remain unasked and unanswered, and follow up afterwards. So give us a little bit of time to follow up on that. But in the meantime, we've still got a couple of things that we want to explore. And the first one is, you know, like what can I, as the individual, do about this?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to answer. And in fact, you know, there's been so many great suggestions already in the chat. So thank you to everybody on the call who's been so interactive there. But I think, you know, the first thing to do is just remember that this is a natural life stage. Somebody going through the menopause isn't broken. They're just going through a particular life stage. And I think one of the other things to remember is that whilst Western culture treats this in quite a negative way, non-Western cultures, very often this is the transition where women step into their power. A lot of the Eastern cultures, the Native Americans, you know, they are very much seeing this as a transition where women step into their power and their wisdom. So you could see this as a transition or a transformation rather than something to soldier on with and feel terrible about. But that being said, I would start by doing some research, being curious. There are some brilliant resources online, but if you Google menopause cure, you're going to get over 1 million responses. So tread really carefully. We'll compile some of the best resources for that resource sheet afterwards. We've talked a little bit about menopause and symptoms tracker apps, but being conscious about things like improving sleep quality, lowering stress levels, taking care to exercise regularly. It doesn't have to be vigorous exercise. Just going for a walk is good enough. So in some cases, thinking about eating healthy fats, adequate protein, plenty of vegetables, all of these sort of normal things that you would do to maintain a healthy body, these can really help with working and playing with your menopause symptoms as well. HRT, we've covered that. It's certainly worth exploring it. Bear in mind that there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment to try and encourage more training to happen for GPs in the UK, because at the moment GPs only get 6 hours of training in menopause and it's optional. So you'll have a bit of a lottery about the GP you get to go and see. There are some great specialists out there if you have access to private healthcare or the funding to pay for it. But be prepared when you go and have a conversation with your GP, and have an inkling about what you would like to happen. And I think for me, I would see this as an opportunity to experiment. So when, as a woman, you're feeling like you might be in a place of failure because you're feeling really down about some of the symptoms that you're experiencing. My favorite quote is from a guy called R. Buckminster Fuller, and he says, "There's no such thing as a failed experiment, only unexpected outcomes." So pick an approach that intrigues you and use it as a learning opportunity. So I'm going to try some stuff. It might do this. And then if it doesn't, I've learned something. I can go away and try something else. I tried Grow Your Own HRT in the form of bean sprouts. There's a great book if you're into fixing things through nutrition. To be honest, after week 2, I didn't want to ever look at another bean sprout. So it wasn't for me, but rather than think of myself as a failure, it was like, well, that's interesting data. I never want to see another bean sprout. I'll try something else. If you're somebody who can find a way to practice breath work, that can really help. We know that cortisol and adrenaline rising will make your symptoms worse. So if you can do some breathing to bring those that cortisol and adrenaline down, then that will really help. And I think, if you can find it in your psyche to laugh a little, even if you're only laughing at yourself or laughing with a trusted friend, then do that. Word of warning though, if you're sitting there thinking, great, I'll make a joke with my wife about this, be really careful. We've done some research on what's kind of okay and not okay, and humor is really mixed. Some women love to have a laugh and love to take the mick out of themselves going through this because it helps to lighten the load. I certainly felt that. Sometimes it's really just not a laughing matter. So get to know the person before you start sending them emojis of the 7 dwarves of menopause, which you can Google and find out about, but it's probably not best to share it with a work colleague until they're ready for it.
So for those 6% of us, or whatever you said, or women who don't understand this, like I say, it's not our right to have that humour, as it were, maybe. And for everyone else who's just kind of looking on in this, again, any last tips before I hand back to Dan for the last question?
I don't know. I just think this is all about curiosity and normalizing this conversation. I think if you can, whether you're one of the 6% or whether you're in it but at a different stage, or you're not there yet, or you're a man, or you were born a man, then just be curious and be empathetic in terms of listening to the answers. You can't know what someone else is going through, which is true of anybody and anything, whether it's mental health or just life in general. Try and sit in their shoes before you pass judgment. And don't judge on one moment of menopause brain fog. Don't stitch somebody's career up because they had one day where they were off, even though that speech or that presentation was really important. They won't be feeling any better about it than you might feel about it, and we don't need to feel judged or less than as a result of some of this stuff that we go through. But I think, think about all the things that you can do. So there's lots you can do as a business. Taking the time to really have those gentle one-on-one empathetic conversations, playing a video or a recording of something. So somebody mentioned they'd sat and watched a video with their husband. Well, why not do it as a team thing, and use it as a discussion point and a piece for curiosity? Think about how you might allow women to adjust things in the workplace for them so they feel more comfortable and more able to perform, whether that's temperature or flexible working hours or working from home occasionally. If you are a uniformed business, think about temperature regulating uniform. There's been some interesting research done in some industry where they found that breathable temperature regulatory fabrics can increase productivity of a woman suffering from hot flushes by 60%. The alternate being true. So if you give someone nylon overalls, they're likely to lose productivity because they're just too hot. Sometimes it's just really simple things like that. Making sure people can access not just toilets, but washing facilities, because sometimes in the early stages of perimenopause, our cycles don't behave the way we might predict. And therefore, that's one embarrassment we could do with less in the workplace. There are some laws you can lever, like equality, sexual harassment, and health and safety. But let's not go there. Let's try not to get that far, and just enjoy having the conversations together. If we can all build our experience and understanding of this life stage, we can improve not only inclusion in the workplace, but just how we all feel about being together. And we can improve we can improve each other through having these conversations.
Brilliant, thank you.
I think you've
Simon,
answered.
anything else from your side?
Well, I was going to say, I think, Liz, you've answered my question. My question was going to be more about, from the workplace, how can we help? But I think you've answered it in that. So thank you for doing that. I think we've got.
And just to add to one thing, a couple of weeks ago, the Scottish Government launched a women's health plan, and one of the 7 goals it has in it is around menstrual and menopause in the workplace, and organisations having an approach. I think they call it a policy, I'm not sure quite what they mean that, by I think it's about 2025. So this is something that's also going to be put in place by the government, quite interestingly.
Brilliant.
So I think we kind of, unless there's any one more question we want to kind of pick out, I think we could probably go to kind of just wrap up and see where we're at. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
there is
Go for it,
one
Karen.
question that I think would be quite interesting to answer. So somebody asked, do we ever get through this? Or is it a case of a mix of symptoms that will stay with us until the end of life? The questioner says, a woman in her 70s tells me she still gets hot flushes.
Yeah, again, it's really individual, but I think the one thing I will say, and I don't want this to sound like negative, because it's just different. I've seen a few websites that say, don't worry, we'll get through it, we'll all go back to normal. There's no going back. So even with HRT, you're not going to get your reproductive behaviors back. Your estrogen, your progesterone won't come back.
Mm-hmm.
What you will do is stabilize. And depending on your experience of menopause and what else you have going on in your body will depend on how your new normal looks. So think about that, that transition. Things will be more stable because you won't be having cycles anymore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Although that being said, I'm about 4 years into postmenopause now, and I still recognize that I have probably a couple of days a month where I feel more grumpy than normal. So I think there's still an underlying cycle, or maybe that's just me, who knows. But we need to find a new normal. Keeping healthy in a new way, knowing that we don't have estrogen and progesterone to help us along anymore, we'll need to think about some of the diet and exercise issues to mitigate for things like osteoporosis. But we still have so much to contribute. In preparation for this, and Dan, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder with this. Daniel said, "Oh, don't we share this with with killer whales?" And I was like, "Yes." Because actually, killer whales, they love this, because they love this period of time, because this is when the killer whale goes through menopause and becomes like the grandmother of the whole flock. It's a matriarchal society. I wouldn't be surprised if they discover that elephants don't go through something like this again, because they're also a matriarchal society. We have a place to be in this world, and so we need to look forward to a new normal. So yes, we'll get through the worst of it, but we will. I've got a friend in their 60s who is still suffering from hot flushes. I'm not intending on giving up HRT until I absolutely have to, because I know it will bring different things to me in terms of things like bone health, etc. We will find a new way of being. It will be different for each of us, but we'll save a fortune on certain sorts of hygiene wear, and things will be more stable. So start to think about what you'd like to create in terms of a transition, and how you would like to step into your power and wisdom.
I love it. Thank you so much, Liz. That is probably a nice place for us to bring the conversation to a close. Before we wrap up, we've got one more question for you live on Slido now. So as you pop the QR code back into the chat, and as you go and have a look for it, I'll also share onto the screen as well. These things take a little minute.
I should maybe clarify for everybody, when I was speaking to Liz earlier in the week, my knowledge of menopause was limited to David Attenborough's program, and there was a fact that I remembered incorrectly, but Liz corrected me, which was humans and dolphins are the only species to go through the menopause in the natural world. But no, it's I was corrected. It's humans and killer whales. But yeah, but David Attenborough did teach me something.
Who knew David Attenborough was a spokesperson for menopause?
Perhaps not even he did. So the poll, yes, so thank you very much to our panelists for today. Thank you to everyone who has joined us and contributed to the conversation. The brilliant conversation that's happened in the sidebar as we've been speaking. Hopefully you found it a really interactive event, and thank you for interacting as we go as well. And to be honest, I'm really pleased with the poll result here to see that through your conversation today, you've been able to help people feel able to start conversations on this now. And I hope that you'll go away from today and use this to start the conversations. Lots of what I've spoken to people about as I've done my own prep for today has been about how we just need to get started talking about this. And, I think we'll be back to talk about it more again in a year's time, and hopefully we'll be advancing then, and we'll be touching a wider group of people. So thank you everyone for taking part today, and thank you very much to Susan, Liz and Daniel for your candidness, but also everybody else who joined in the conversation too. I appreciate your candidness too. Dan, as a sponsor from Spirit, I'll hand to you for a final word and wrap up.
I'll just mirror really what you said there, Karen. Thank you again, Liz and Susan and Karen and Stephen in the background.
Yes, Stephen, thank you so much.
all of this. I'm gonna post it in the chat in a minute. I just want to leave with this one, which was a friend of mine sent me this last night, and it was there's a hashtag rock my menopause Instagram, Twitter thing going on, and it's what is a menovist? And it's one who stands up for those going through the menopause, a person who openly encourages and engages in conversations around menopause and plays a part in stamping out the taboo. So I would just like to close with men would like to be menovists, and please, we would, while we all find it a bit embarrassing to get engaged in the conversation, we all want to talk about it. But again, thank you everybody for your time. It's been really good.
Thank you so much for everyone being on the call.
Yeah, thank you. Okay,
Thank
we'll
you.
wrap there.
Great.
And 5
Thank you.
minutes early. Well done, everybody. Thanks, everyone. And yeah, look out for follow-up material from us. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Everyone, thanks. Really nice
Thank
event.
you.
Should we head across?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I'll see you there.